Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome once again to the Miller Center. It's lovely to see you all here. Please feel free to keep munching away on your sandwiches. We have food for the mind as well as the body here at the Miller Center. My name is Will Hitchcock. I'm a professor of history here at the university, and I'm the director of academic programs at the Miller Center. As you all know, there's so many friends of the Miller Center here today. I don't have to tell you, but I will do so anyway. This is, the center is a place where scholars and public policy professionals and thinkers and writers and the public come together to engage big national questions that we all care a lot about. And this is one of the great things about being associated with the Miller Center, is that we're constantly engaged in the big questions of the day, and we hear from so many different voices. Now, the Great Issues series, which you are attending here today, is a program that brings together the best scholars in the country to bring them here to Charlottesville to help us use the study of the recent past to illuminate the present. That's really what we're trying to get at in this series, to think about recent events in their historical context and to look forward, to draw some policy conclusions from studying recent events. We use the tagline in the Great Issues series. What we're doing here is scholarship in the public interest. So the Great Issues series is in its inaugural year this year. Some of you will have attended a couple of the earlier events. We had a terrific discussion on the politics of disaster, which, despite the title, was actually a wonderful panel. It was about how the state and federal governments respond to natural disasters, have done so in the past and are still struggling with that today. We explored the grand strategy and foreign policy of President Ronald Reagan in a wonderful discussion. Next week, next Friday, we'll be looking at the history of capitalism, which is a subject that scholars are getting more and more interested in part because we are living in such turbulent economic times. We want to understand better how we got to this moment in our global and national economic history. And then on February 20, I want to make sure that you have this on your calendar as well. We're going to be having two scholars come and talk about the CIA and the question of torture, reading the Senate report on CIA detention and interrogation. You will know about the Senate report. It's a major news item of the last month, and we have two scholars who are very well versed in the topic who will help us make sense of it all. What does it mean? What are the policy implications? What should the public know about that? A very big and rather intimidating document. So mark your calendars and do plan on coming. All the details are at millercenter.org. I'm going to turn the podium over to Guillen McKee in a moment. I just do want to ask you to squelch your various electronic devices before we get going. You can step on them, you can stand on them, you can snap them over your knee, whatever you need to do. So I'm going to turn over to Guillen, who's going to MC this conversation. Guillen McKee is the chair of the Great Issues program here at the Miller Center. He'll introduce our speaker. Guillen is an associate professor of public policy here at UVA, and he has been at the Miller Center in the Presidential Recordings program since August of 2002. So he's a real knowledgeable veteran about the Miller Center. Since 2009, he's also been teaching at the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. He has a PhD from Berkeley, and he's an expert on urban policy, the history of civil rights and race, and on the politics and the economics of healthcare. So I'll turn things over to Guillen, and he will introduce Adam Goodman, our speaker today. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to have you here at the Miller Center today for our first Great Issues event of 2015. Now, one of the things that we're really trying to do with Great Issues is to bring young scholars to the Miller Center and UVA to give you a chance to really hear some of the cutting-edge scholarship, because the truth of the matter is that while the old stars often do wonderful work too, some of the true innovation is happening with the not the kids, that's the wrong, man, totally stepped on that, with our younger generation of scholars, deeply in touch with the literature and thinking about problems in new ways. And that's very much the case of our guest today. Adam Goodman is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's also a current Miller Center National Fellow. So it's wonderful to have him with us today. Adam's dissertation examines the history of the deportation of Mexicans from the United States since 1942 and how that figures in and plays a part in the wider history of migration and immigration policy, really right up to the present. Along with the Miller Center Fellowship, Adam's work has really already been recognized. He's received a Fulbright Garcia Robles Fellowship. Last summer, he was a part of an NEH summer seminar on rethinking international migration. He's published widely, both in academic journals and also in the popular media, including, among others, The Nation, Al Jazeera America, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Dallas Morning News, Salon, the list goes on. It's another key thing that Brian really emphasizes with the fellows is to try to reach a wider audience, and that very much links into our purpose as well. So I'm had a chance to read the paper and talk to Adam this morning. This is a fascinating work, and with that, I will simply turn it over to Adam.
Well, thank you, Gian, and Will, and Brian, and Stephanie, and everyone at the Miller Center for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm based in Mexico City, so it's a nice break to come to Charlottesville. It's my first visit. And aside from the weather, everything's been just wonderful. Although not too bad. You know, I grew up in upstate New York, so that's the real winter. So today I'm going to talk about both my dissertation project as well as the chapter that was pre-circulated and shared, and I hope that we'll be able to draw a number of connections between the work I've done from the middle of the 20th century to some of what's happening today in terms of immigration policy and politics. My dissertation is a transnational history of the deportation of Mexicans from the United States since 1942. It uses a variety of Spanish and English language archival sources as well as oral histories I've conducted in Mexico and the United States, and some information I've been able to obtain through the Freedom of Information Act. I'm waiting for a lot more, but hopefully that'll come through eventually. And it uses these sources to explore how the institutional and political history of deportation and the social history of deportees has changed since 1942. I'm both interested in the policy and the politics and the effect that the policy and the politics have on people. And I try to get at that a bit in this chapter and certainly throughout the project. Just to give a brief overview, and I'm going to keep my comments brief because I'd much rather have an open discussion with everyone here, either regarding the paper or kind of immigration policy more generally. But the first half of my project discusses the period from 1942 to 1964, the Bracero era, which is when the Bracero program, a bilateral contract labor program between Mexico and the United States, brought 4 to 5 million Mexican laborers, mostly agricultural laborers, but also some people in industry or on railroads, and they brought them to the United States on temporary short-term contracts. And this is also the time in which documented as well as undocumented migration really took off and expanded tremendously. Okay? And this is the period in which the current moment that we're living in, the modern or contemporary deportation regime, has its roots and finds its origins, where many of the policies, tactics, and means of deportation were created and established that are still in use today. Just have a few slides to show. Part of my project tries to examine and really push the broad reach deportation has, not only on individuals, on single people who are deported by order of the federal government, but also on the many people connected to them. So deportation throughout U.S. history is primarily targeted and primarily affected male laborers, in their late teens into their 30s. That's the vast majority, but it has also targeted women and children. This picture here is of a family in the McAllen, Texas detention center in 1953. And of course, this is something we've been hearing about a lot in the news today. And people on both sides of the border, even if they themselves were not removed, were affected by deportation, by one of their family members being deported. And in some cases, they themselves also shaped the history of deportation by calling on the Mexican and U.S. governments to act. There's also a number of different ways in which people have been deported throughout U.S. history. And this is something I examine in this first half, the different modes and means of transportation that have been used to remove people, to physically move people by force from the United States. Some people simply cross the border on foot, over land. Buses have also been used very commonly to take people both within the United States, from the interior to the border, and sometimes from the Mexican border into the interior of Mexico. For a period in the 1950s, there were boats that went from Port Isabel, Texas, in the Gulf of Mexico, down to Veracruz. And this was operating from 1954 until 1956. It's called the boat lift. And the companies that operated the boat lift were private Mexican companies, for-profit companies, that stood to benefit financially, and that there were some cases of conflicts of interest and corruption involved as well, where Mexican government officials who were in charge of the deportation from that side of the border were also financial stakeholders in these companies. This is a photo from Chicago, actually, of men being deported in the 1950s, around the time of when I was writing about in this chapter. Many people were taken by train and then later by plane to the border to then be removed into Mexico. So these are some of the issues that I try to get at in the first half of the project. And to this day, just last year, I was in the Mexico City airport making a trip back to the States, and I ran into a man that had just been deported and arrived in Mexico City without any way to get to Oaxaca, the state in southwestern Mexico where he was from. And these are things that have their roots in the middle of the 20th century, but in many cases still continue to this day. The second half of my project explores how deportation has changed, both qualitatively and quantitatively over time. And I think this is where I, and as an historian, can really offer some perspective, hopefully, to current debates and discussions about immigration and immigration policy. And taking a longer view, starting in the 1940s and going until today, allows us to see the many ways in which deportation has changed and the effect that it's had on people's lives. These are photographs that I took of different individuals who had been deported, mostly in the 1970s and 80s, that I did oral histories with in a small town in the central western Mexican state of Jalisco, which is kind of in the breadbasket of the Mexican migration region, which has a long history dating back to the early 20th century. And these stories of the people who themselves were deported are a key part of my work and something I'm hoping to bring forth to the discussion. Oftentimes, the experiences of the people most affected by the federal immigration bureaucracy are silenced or not heard or not recorded in the archives. And I've tried through a variety of methods, both reading against the grain and archival material, as well as conducting oral histories, I've tried to get at some of their experiences to really examine the social history and how it's affected their lives and how it's changed over time. So the man on the left, just to give a brief story, the man on the left is named Andres. And Andres had a couple of experiences in which he interacted with the federal immigration bureaucracy. And he, along with the man in the top right, who's playing pool, it's a small picture, I'm sorry about that, had both interacted with immigration officials on a number of different occasions, but really saw it as something that wasn't that consequential. It wasn't something they saw and kind of associated with what we think of as deportation today, because what it meant to be deported in the mid-1970s and early 1980s was something different than what it means today. It was less permanent. The border between the United States and Mexico was less militarized. It was easier to return. So the man on the top right, Agustin, had told me that he was deported approximately 70 times throughout his life. That was an estimate. I mean, take into consideration possibility of exaggeration and memory having an effect, but certainly a number of times, including one year in which he had attempted to cross the border 11 times and was sent back until he finally was able to. But both of these men, in addition to many of the other people that with whom I've spoken, really didn't connect their experience of being detained and deported with what we know today as the experience of so many people. And it's really in the post-1986 and post-1996 period when deportation takes a punitive turn and comes to mean something different, something more permanent. And today it's harsher than it ever has been before. And having the broad view, the historical perspective, allows us to get at that. This is a graph that I put together of deportations throughout U.S. history, starting in 1892, when the federal government began recording deportation statistics. And as you can see, the first point where there's a real spike is right around 1942, when the Bracero program commenced. And as I mentioned, Mexican migration, whether documented or undocumented, really increased. And since then, it has more or less since 1960 or so, and then especially after 1965, when the Bracero program ends and the 1965 Immigration Act puts a cap on immigration from the Western Hemisphere for the first time, that deportations shoot up. And I'm not sure how clear it is there from the back, but the red line is total deportations. The blue line, which runs along the bottom until around 1996 or so, are what the federal government calls removals. And the green line are what the federal government calls returns or voluntary departures. And now, one of the things that I really tried to put forth forcefully in this chapter, and the important part of this chapter in terms of connecting to the larger project, is that the United States, for a long time, for many, many decades, has used a variety of means to physically remove people or to coerce people into leaving the country. Certainly through formal deportations, which are what we hear about today, the 400,000 people that President Obama is deporting, those are just the removals, the blue line at the bottom there. But the vast majority of people throughout U.S. history have been deported through voluntary departure, which is anything but voluntary, as well as through scare tactic and fear-driven campaigns that encourage people to self-deport, in today's parlance, or to leave on their own. And I try to show the very active role of the state and of the federal government in pushing those policies and the creative ways in which they've tried to go beyond their limited financial means to remove people from the country. And this is something we can hopefully talk about more in the question and answer. But you'll see almost throughout the last 70 years, the total number of deportations mirrors the number of returns or the people that are deported through voluntary departure, which are not included by many people as deportations, although throughout history they have been used interchangeably. And this also brings up another important point here as I wrap up, that 98% of all deportations throughout U.S. history have happened since 1942, and more than 90% of the people deported have been Mexican. So my project focuses on the history of deportation from the United States to Mexico, because that largely, for the most part, has been the history of deportation from the United States. And that's something that is changing a little bit today. There are more people from Central America and some other parts of the world who are being deported in larger numbers. But these are very recent changes, and some of, hopefully, the continuities as well as contrast that'll come out during the question and answer period. So with that, I think I'll turn it back to Guillen and look forward to the dialogue.
Thank you, Adam. I wanted to maybe start the discussion off with thinking a little bit about the specific legacies of the case you wrote about in the chapter you shared with us today, Operation Wetback, and really what the long-term significance of Operation Wetback might be, and what it shows us about the debate over immigration reform today.
Sure. I think there are many important takeaways from Operation Wetback, which is the campaign in the spring and summer and into the fall of 1954 that the Immigration and Naturalization Service waged to deport Mexicans not only from the southwest border region, but also from the interior of the country. Interior enforcement, which is talked about frequently today, has a much longer and deeper history, which scholars have not acknowledged fully. And I think that there are some important lessons, certainly about today's moment in the history of enforcement in established communities in the interior that we can learn from the mid-20th century. And then the other point is certainly that the INS's campaign in Operation Wetback, its whole strategy of deporting people, was based on these mixed means of formal deportations, although almost entirely voluntary departure, which you'll see in the graph there. Oh, I think it maybe disappeared. You saw in the graph there. Almost all of the 1 million people that the federal government claims to have removed in fiscal year 1954 were deported via voluntary departure. It's also worth noting that the vast majority of those did not result from Operation Wetback. Okay? The fiscal year 1954, from the stats, ends June 30th, and the operation was launched in the middle of June. So only a couple of weeks of the official operation were included in those stats. The vast majority of deportations during that year occurred before the INS launched its campaign. But an important point is that the INS then celebrated and carried forward Operation Wetback as the historic campaign that led to the million deportations. And it's still oftentimes referenced in news and major newspapers in such terms today. But in reality, it was these mixed methods that were used, the formal deportations, voluntary departure, as well as fear campaigns around self-deportation that originated in the early to mid-20th century and have been used ever since then to effect deportations.
Thank you. Well, among our guests today are members of Brian Ballas' graduate seminar in American Political Development, and I happen to know that part of their class participation grade is based on the questions that they asked. So, with your forbearance, I'm going to begin with our graduate students to give them a shot at asking Adam about his work. Anyone from, now I've really put the pressure on, in addition to Brian's weighing in on them. Yeah, and if you can identify yourself too, that'd be great.
I'm one of said graduate students, so I'll be seeing you later as well. Joey Thompson from the history department. I was interested in your chapter, which I enjoyed very much. You talk about Attorney General Brownell's conception of these immigrant workers, migrant workers, as a subversive class. And so I was just wondering if you maybe could speak to kind of the what are the driving factors of that kind of racialized logic, and why are they seen as subversive? Or is it something that we could look to maybe in the economics, maybe like mechanized agriculture and the use of pesticides in this period, and maybe not so much of a need for these types of workers?
Great. Thank you, Joey, for that question. And this is a way in which I guess there are both continuities and discontinuities, but from the current moment. Certainly the Attorney General, Herbert Brownell Jr., in the 1950s, had many quotes in which he referred to Mexican migrant workers, specifically unauthorized Mexican migrant workers, as a subversive class, or in such terms. And Cold War rhetoric is prevalent throughout the immigration archive during this period. So there's tremendous concern on part of the federal government that people, not only from Mexico, but from other parts of the country, perhaps from Eastern Europe or elsewhere, might be coming across the border with Mexico. It should also be noted that the immigration bureaucracy pointed out that there was no such evidence that had happened. They hadn't found anybody actually, but the fear was there, or at least it was used as justification for harsher policies. And that's something we certainly see today in terms of justifying immigration policies and the militarization of the border, is the potential of who might be able to enter the country. And I think there's another part to your question which you brought up there at the end, and which is certainly also the case, in that the federal government, through this major deportation campaign, was trying to push workers into the Bracero program, was trying to push the unauthorized workers that many growers throughout the Southwest had long relied on into the Bracero program, so they could come and be, I guess, more easily identified, more easily controlled perhaps, and ultimately exploitable as well. But there's certainly a big push, not only from the federal government, but from organized labor during this period, and from other groups who feel like, especially local governments, and this is something where there's certainly continuity, local governments feel like the immigrants who have entered their communities in the 1950s, 1940s, and 50s have been a burden on their resources, and they write to the federal government, specifically the immigration bureaucracy, to try to resolve that. And part of Operation Wetback was responding to those needs, in addition to the immigration bureaucracy attempting to establish itself as a strong agency within a growing federal bureaucracy.
Let's go to the back row.
Hey, Christopher Maternowski, graduate student in the history department. My question is, you note on page 13 of your chapter that John Foster Dulles asked the USIA to disseminate its message in Mexico to try to discourage Mexican nationals from crossing the border. So my question then is, did they also publicize that message abroad, beyond the borders of Mexico? And what was the international response? In particular, did it elicit a Soviet response?
Thank you. Thank you, Christopher. So the part of the campaign that the immigration bureaucracy in the United States waged was publicity and information, both to scare people into leaving on their own, but also to stop people maybe from coming outside of the established means of the Bracero program. So there were campaigns done along the border with Mexico in both the California as well as Arizona and Texas portions of the border, and into Mexican communities where radio announcements were put together to be broadcast in northern Mexico. Leaflets were planned to be dropped out of airplanes along the border. And the federal government, through the highest levels of government in the State Department, also attempted to communicate with their colleagues in Mexico in an attempt to stem the flow of unauthorized migrants heading from Mexico to the United States. They were largely unsuccessful in doing that. The Mexican government responded that we have no authority to regulate the movement of our own citizens within our own national territory. There was a moment in the 1950s, for a very brief period of time, where a Mexican border patrol was set up, but just with the Texas-Tamaulipas border in the southeastern part of the U.S.-Mexico border. And the force was never larger than a couple of dozen people, and really didn't have a tremendous effect or any lasting impact. So those efforts certainly were made, and in terms of whether there was reaction from beyond Mexico or outside of the region, not that I came across, although something that I haven't included in any of my work, but I did see in the archives, where there was a certain amount of circulation of knowledge during this time, where foreign governments from different places in Europe as well as Asia sent officials to the U.S.-Mexico border to learn about the border enforcement practices that the United States was implementing so they could take it back home and perhaps put it to use for their own situation and context. That's maybe something for further investigation, although I'm not clear as to how much information is out there.
I'm not a Brian Bowell student, but I did wrest the mic out of their hands, and I'll give it back to them in a moment and to the rest of the group. I have two questions. One has to do with civil rights and context here. 1954 is a fascinating moment, and this deportation project that you describe is incredible. But it's also the moment of Brown versus Board of Education, and I wonder if you could just describe what's going on in America in 1954 with such fascinating cross-cutting patterns. On the one hand, sending the military basically down into the Southwest to round up Mexican laborers and physically put them on buses and deport them. On the other hand, a breakthrough of the civil rights regime. It's a fascinating moment, and maybe you could just talk about that coincidence. The second is self-deportation. That's a term that's in the current debate, and I don't quite know what that means. And I think you've implied that you have a real view on it in your remarks, but tell us a little bit more about how it works. For example, Augustine, the guy who came to the US 70 times and went back home 70 times, was he self-deported of any of those 70 times? How does it actually function? Is this a legitimate legal regime, or is this some kind of sub-legal method? So it's a fascinating term. It has a lot of contemporary relevance. Maybe you could unpack it for us a little more. Thanks.
You get an A+, you can take the course anytime.
Thank you, Will, for both of those questions. Both very good questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. There certainly is a broader context for the period, and maybe it's one of contrasts in some sense, or bifurcated histories, perhaps. For a long time, and I think really until recently in terms of scholarly interest, the story and the history of the United States had been told largely in black and white terms, and the divide between the white community, African American community, and certainly the history of civil rights was often told along those lines, although there's been many people who have worked on both history of the Chicano movement and history of Asians and Asian Americans during this period as well, and to show the many connections between them. In terms of the particular context of immigration enforcement at this time, the broader picture is really dictated, as I mentioned, by the Cold War. So there's, part of it is the history of Mexican labor migration and the Bracero program, which originated during World War II, supposedly because of a labor shortage and labor demand, but people like Cindy Hehemovich, historian at William & Mary, have shown that In fact, there wasn't a shortage, but there was demand to have more expendable labor at lower costs. The history of Mexican labor migration, certainly plays a central role in the history of deportation and immigration enforcement, as I tried to point out, to show how closely connected they are. But also the Cold War context comes up again and again. And there are many times in which people were targeted for deportation, especially from the interior of the country, for their political beliefs or for their political actions. There's a case study that I use in another chapter from the dissertation that tells the story of Rodolfo and Consuelo Lozoya, who were a couple from Chicago that had 7 children together. And Consuelo was a US citizen, as were the children. Rodolfo was not. In 1957, he went back to Mexico to be with his mother, who was very sick and was dying at the time, and went back to northern Mexico. And when he tried to re-enter the United States, he was excluded by officials of the Immigration Service because he was a labor activist and because at a point earlier in time he had self-identified as a member of the Communist Party. And there's this tremendous series of correspondence between the couple in which they really talk about the impact that the separation had on them, the impact that family separation had on them, and the justifications. And I've actually gotten a fair amount of information from the government through the FOIA requests, the Freedom of Information Act requests, about this particular case, but I'm waiting for a lot more. So if anyone knows anybody, I'd love to talk to you after. But the context for this, and the context that comes up again and again, is that labor activists are being targeted. Not only Mexican labor activists, but people from Europe and from other places as well. So almost all of the people who are not Mexican that are being deported, in the mid to late 1950s, are usually, labor activists from one place or another. So that's kind of the broader context in which I think the immigration regime is operating during this period. And the second question, I can expand a little bit about what I mean by self-deportation. And it's important to historicize that as well. And as Will pointed out, that's something that has been in the news a lot lately. It came up most forcefully in a debate in 2012 when Mitt Romney, the presidential candidate, mentioned it as part of his vision for immigration policy and immigration reform. And what I mean by self-deportation, and what I think former Governor Romney meant, was that the local governments or the federal government would create situations in which immigrants living here without authorization would feel the need to leave the country on their own. And I put on their own in quotes because I really want to put forth today, and I would argue that the federal government, although it has this hands-off policy, they're actually very actively engaged in creating the conditions in which people are responding. So the idea that someone is leaving on their own, or quote-unquote self-deporting, is somewhat of a misnomer, or it hides the very active role of local or federal government in creating those conditions in which people decide to leave. And for my case, in this chapter, in 1954, 1955, during Operation Wetback, that was one of the main things that the government relied on and publicized widely, and according to at least some reports, was fairly effective.
So I think Jonathan and then Judge.
I'm John Cohen. I'm another one of Brian's minions. You quote in kind of the early pages specific citizens' responses in writing to Brownell about the immigration in their area. I was wondering if you could speak to, I guess, change over time in terms of how private citizens have been able to either engage with INS or have responded to immigration, and how that possibly has affected the political debates and cultural debates around illegal immigration or immigration in general from Mexico.
Yes, Thank you, John. So in the mid-1950s, when the INS was launching these deportation campaigns, and it should be noted that Operation Wetback, although it was the largest of those, it was not the first. There were some precursors to the strategies that they employed. They received a large number of letters, outraged, criticizing and critiquing the agency for what it was doing. And many times these came from interested parties. These came from Southern growers who for more than a decade by that point had depended on cheap agricultural labor and didn't want the INS to come and take away their labor force as their crops rotted. And that was especially prevalent in South Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley, where there was a very strong grower presence and very strong growers associations. And although I haven't come across any evidence of a coordinated effort, I'm pretty sure that there was at least some coordination by these large growers associations to rally and motivate their members to write in as individuals. So they don't identify as part of a larger group, but based on the language that they're using, you can kind of assume that there's some kind of coordination and orchestration. Deportation also played out differently, and the response to it was different in different parts of the country. So in the interior, people wrote to the INS upset about the recent drives in Chicago of people like the Lozoyas who had been there for more than 20 years. But these were largely immigrants' rights groups or activist groups or simply community members that were upset about what was happening in their local community and members of their community who had become their friends and neighbors. But they aren't using the same kind of language. They aren't using the same kinds of terminology and the strong words that many of the Southwestern growers were using, who are more concerned about keeping their laborers as opposed to people's individual, civil rights or human rights as well. There's some mention of that in the letters. I think that certainly this is something that is constant over time. There's always been response to the immigration bureaucracy. To get to your point about change over time, it's unclear, and I don't think we can necessarily chart a straight line of how effective pressure has been. There were a lot of people complaining in South Texas about the upcoming drive, and much of it was in anticipation of the drive because the PR campaign was rolled out ahead of time to try to get people to leave on their own. But the drive still went ahead. It still went ahead as planned, regardless of what many of the growers and local residents had said and had reported and had complained to congressmen, senators, the president. There's also an interesting point that should be noted that a lot of wives and a lot of women wives of growers and women in the Rio Grande Valley wrote both to the president but also to the president's wife, to Mamie Eisenhower, appealing to her to try to get her to act or perhaps talk with her husband to affect change, which never ended up happening. I think today, we've certainly seen that response to the pressure of citizens and non-citizens who have lived in the United States for a long time has been somewhat effective, oftentimes in changing or altering immigration policy, certainly with the DREAM movement and young immigration activists and their families, who in many cases have either been spared of deportation or their deportations have been put on hold for the time being without any kind of final resolution. But I think they've been largely successful through the different media campaigns that they have waged in both helping individuals, but really enforcing larger action by President Obama, around DACA, the deferred action for children that came to the United States, and then more recently, the executive action or order.
Order, I think, yeah. Either way, yeah.
Yes, that President Obama made, that it is much broader and encompasses many more people. I don't think that would have happened without the pressure, from citizens and DREAM activists. Certainly not the only factor, but I don't think that it would have even been on the table had people not put pressure on the government and expressed their very strong views.
Okay, let's go to Judge, and then to the front, and then we'll open it to the, do we have somebody already lined up? Okay, and then we'll open it to the group.
Hi, Judge Glock. I'm more of a Brian lackey than a minion. My question, two quick questions. The first one is something I'm sure there's an easy answer to, but I just haven't ever heard it. Why, if there was no quotas on Mexican or Western Hemisphere immigration from the 1920s to 1965, was there even the need to deport? Was the getting a visa process very bureaucratic? Was it expensive? Did it impose certain obligations or expenses on them? And so that's something that I've been curious about for a while. And then the second question is, so I wasn't clear on exactly why removals and returns dropped off so steeply in 1954. Do they feel they were successful, that this really did immigration from the Western Hemisphere and Mexico drop significantly, or did just the resources and the attention shift after they felt that they had made that sort of public showing? Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. The first question about why, if there are no quotas, was there even a need to deport, was there were still formal channels in which people had to go through, primarily the Bracero program, during this period, in which they were, without getting too bogged down in the details, the contracting happened in Mexico. There were a certain number of spaces that were available and doled out kind of on a local basis, which led to some problems and corruption. But there was a certain fixed number as determined by the bilateral agreement. And the border at that point, it wasn't open, although it wasn't regulated or militarized, by any means. So there were still formal channels in which people had to use, as far as I understand. And I think your preface to the question about this, I'm sure there's an easy answer to this. I don't know the exact details of the nitty-gritty details to the process of going not through the Bracero program, but I think that it was more difficult than perhaps just, it definitely was more difficult than just perhaps wanting to go and then going. And you certainly wouldn't be able to gain, work permits or other things that you might need in the United States if you were to go. The second question about removals and returns, and as you saw in that graph, that there is a steep drop after 1954. And this is something that scholars debate, and also the INS, the immigration bureaucracy. According to the immigration bureaucracy and in the annual reports, the Commissioner of Immigration, Joseph M. Swing, a former military man, retired lieutenant general, who had served in everything from the Pershing expedition in the early 20th century into Mexico to try to capture Pancho Villa, to World War I, to directing troops in World War II and during Korea. He became the immigration commissioner. And he writes in the subsequent annual reports in 1955 and beyond that the numbers drop off so much because fewer people were coming and because the operation had been so successful. Really a way of celebrating and trying to solidify the success and kind of misremembering the operation in some ways. Other scholars like Kelly Lytle Hernandez, a professor at UCLA, have argued that the attention is shifted away at that point. And I think ultimately it's very difficult to know, just as it's difficult to know during Operation Wetback how many people were deported as a result of the specific operation as opposed to kind of general efforts that were made. And in this period after, it's unclear how many people were coming and maybe avoiding or evading detection and apprehension. It's unclear whether that changes over time, the chances of being apprehended. These are things that we can't really control for. But what we can see, and in some sense, the operation was most successful, perhaps, at pushing people into the Bracero program. So the number of contract laborers after 1954, shoots up. And I forget the exact page citation, but I do mention that toward the end, where the number of braceros contracted in Texas and in California especially, shoots up tremendously. And for the last 10 years of the Bracero program, averaged over 300,000 people a year, and some years topping 400,000 people. So there is some evidence as to why that increase happens. It's hard to suss out maybe specifically, but perhaps people were going in smaller numbers outside of the Bracero program and in larger numbers through the program, although that proves to be short-lived when the program terminates at the end of 1964. And from that point on, as you saw in the chart, the number of unauthorized immigrants as well as apprehensions and deportations really increases dramatically.
Hi, I'm Cecilia. I'm also a graduate student here in the department. I have two questions, and the first is about the increasingly punitive nature of the deportation regime. And I'm curious what that has to do with the privatization of prisons as well as detention centers in deportation centers. The second question is how deportation changes as immigrants change. So when women and young people show up. So I was thinking about DACA, I was thinking about the Dreamers, but also the unaccompanied minors. So how the deportation response changes as women and children show up. Because when you're talking about the Bracero era, you're talking a lot about men, and men who are much more mobile, who can do the sort of 70 deportation model. But the change is when you come and set down ties and start attending schools and engaging with social services. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Cecilia. Yeah. So the last portion of my project looks at the post-1996 period where there are some important changes in immigration law that both expand the number of offenses that are considered deportable offenses, and some of them are now treated retroactively at that point as well. So an offense you had committed in the past that was not a deportable offense at the time all of a sudden became a deportable offense. And those changes in the law in 1996 led to, and also an increased amount of resources dedicated to immigration enforcement, combined to lead to a spike in the number of removals, or these formal deportations, which have grown tremendously since 1996. And that's what we still hear about today, as I mentioned. It's the 400,000 people being deported under Obama. Those are removals. And I think it's the rise of removals that really marks part of the change. And to segue to the second part of your question, the other part are the expanding business interests. The business interest driving deportation is not necessarily new, but I think the extent to which they're involved and the extent to which they're driving detention and deportation is new and certainly has expanded. There are many cases, and most prominently, I mentioned in passing, the state-level immigration laws that were passed since 2010, specifically in Arizona. It was revealed that the private prison companies had a large part and did very active lobbying in trying to get those laws passed, as communities have come to depend on the jobs that those prison companies provide. And also, the federal government has had to become more creative, is one way to put it, I guess, in the ways in which they are minimizing costs and also expediting deportations. But as the amount of resources, or as the resources dedicated to immigration enforcement has increased over time, that has had a big effect on immigrants' experiences in detention and being deported. So today, for the first time since before the Bracero program began, there are more removals than returns. The the technical name that are given to the voluntary departures, where someone signs an agreement to leave the country, and then there are different consequences and lesser consequences for the future. There's more opportunity to return to the United States if you leave through voluntary departure as opposed to being formally deported. And you also, another benefit is that people know that they will be leaving relatively soon and will not be held in immigration detention for an indefinite amount of time, or maybe moved around to different detention centers in different parts of the United States. I do want to just pause for 1 second here to point out something that I think is important, which your question brings up. And that's related to the broader criminal justice system as well, in that the whole deportation regime that the U.S. has created since the first half of the 20th century is built upon the model of deporting people through the variety of means, as I pointed out, through formal deportations, voluntary departure, and also the scare tactics. But the immigration bureaucracy cannot handle the formal deportations on a large scale for everybody. They can now more than ever before, but they still can't deport everyone that they would ideally like to. And it would have taken too many resources. It's just like incentivizing people to take plea deals or plea bargains. Most crimes never make it to court. Most cases are never heard. People take a bargain or take a plea deal because the system would be completely overwhelmed. It's already overwhelmed, and they're just looking at a fraction of the people who would have to, number one, be housed in a detention center, number two, be brought forth before an immigration judge, and then transported on the federal government's dime. So the system has never been able to accommodate and never been built to deport everyone it could through formal deportations. It's relied on these other means because there was no other way. And there's no individual incentive for immigrants to try to change that. If you as an individual have the choice between signing a voluntary departure slip and leaving sooner rather than later, as well as having more possibilities perhaps of returning to the United States in the future, or sitting in a detention center, maybe being flown around the country to different private detention centers, who knows where, for an undetermined amount of time, and then being deported formally and having harsher consequences put upon re-entering in the future, most people are going to choose the voluntary departure, as they do, logically. Now, if there was some kind of, and this is not in anyone's individual interest, but if there was some kind of organizing effort that was made in which people decided to band together, people that had been apprehended decided to band together and say, I'm not going to accept voluntary departure. I'm going to stay, try to fight my case, have it heard, and exercise whatever due process rights I have, although very limited, for non-citizens, then the system would break. And I don't know what would happen. But that probably will never be the case for logical reasons. Sorry to go off on a little tangent, but I do want to get to your second question as well about deportation changing as immigrants change. And this is an important point as well. And something I found in my research is that deportation policy and immigration policy has a gendered history in which, yes, men have been primarily targeted, but women and children have also been targeted. And in some cases, depending on who is being deported, whether it was an individual man who was alone, or a couple, or a family, or a woman with a child or children, they were deported via different means. So instead of being moved laterally, another technique that the Immigration Service developed in the 1950s that's still used to this day, it's been in the paper many times this past year, were lateral deportations, or moving people along the border and deporting them in places that are more remote or more difficult for them to maybe re-enter. In some cases, that was not only punitive, but dangerous and done intentionally by the service as a way of discouraging people from re-entering. So in the 1950s, women and children were most often excluded from those lateral deportations, whereas single male laborers were not, although that changed as well during Operation Wetback. But there's also, I guess, a hierarchy being created, and immigration policy treating gender as a normative field in which gender operated not only as differences between men and women and the sexes, but there were quote unquote good immigrants and bad immigrants. There are good men and bad that could be documented and undocumented, and also women who were treated differently depending on whether they were there with their husband and a child, or women who were apprehended and determined by the Immigration Service to be prostitutes were treated differently than women who were there with a family or with their partner. So there are these hierarchies that are created by immigration policy during this period, both between men and women, but also among men and women. I'm sorry, among men and then among women.
So you've got, I think, a gentleman in the back. Go ahead, yes.
Thank you. Like most Americans, I'd love to have comprehensive immigration reform because I can't imagine it be much worse than what we have now. But I belong to a group called Progressives for Immigration Reform, and their concern is one of scale as much as of background or particular characteristics. And I think that all aspects of current deportation, as you call it, Obama's measures and so are a good example of that, are really not so much hierarchical as they are trying to draw different discriminations based on human feelings about breaking up families on the one hand, or about the concern for labor exploitation on the other. That all of us, I think, are somehow caught in those different emotions and different ways of looking at it. My question to you, however, is, do you think that deportation will necessarily be part of a comprehensive immigration reform? And if it is, how would you discriminate among those who will remain and those who will, under any vocabulary you choose to use, will leave?
Yeah, that's a great question. And unfortunately, from my perspective, I think that if there is any kind of comprehensive immigration reform, which I personally don't foresee in the near future, there was a moment right after the election in 2012 where there was some hope, although I think measured hope from some, which was very wise. But if there is any kind of immigration reform, I think that it will include enhanced or ramped up enforcement as a key part of that. I don't necessarily think that is good or will lead anywhere good, but it seems like Democrats and Republicans in the Congress and even the president, seem to agree on that there should be more people, more Border Patrol agents on the border. The border enforcement should be stronger. You'll hear this rhetoric, over and over again. That's usually one of the first things that is said from both sides of the aisle and by the president. And that, in my opinion, isn't going to lead us anywhere good. It's not going to solve any of the problems or issues that exist. I think if history teaches anything, certainly past immigration reform efforts have taken into consideration a lot of the things that are on the table today. And unless provisions are put forth for the future to deal with people who will come in the future to this country, the policy will be very short-sighted and will be here 10, 15, 20, 25 years from now, just as we are now today, discussing the same issues. I think that there's a lot of importance and emphasis placed on border control and sealing the border. You'll hear a lot of rhetoric about sealing the border. I don't think that'll happen. People are going to keep coming and finding ways to come to the United States through authorized or unauthorized channels. And I think that good policy and smart policy would acknowledge that. It's not good to maybe say that publicly, for a politician to say and acknowledge publicly that we may never be able to completely control our borders. Raises all kinds of questions about sovereignty and national power and national interests and the nation's identity. But I think the smart thing to do would be to create more channels for people to come to the United States through authorized legal means. Acknowledge that they are going to come and create more opportunities for people to come. And that will benefit the country. It'll also benefit the individuals. The system that we have now and are living in today puts a lot of the risk and the danger on the individuals, on the migrants themselves. The number of migrant deaths in the desert has increased dramatically in the last decade or two. And those are just the people, last year there was, I think, 477 people that were found in the US-Mexico border region. And those are just the remains that are identified, of course. So I think smart policy would account for the realities and respond accordingly.
Okay, let's go. Let's see, one more in the back, and then we'll swing to the front and go down the row.
Looking at some of the countries that are particularly troubled in Central America, I'm thinking of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. There are people there who are desperate to get out, and it's obviously getting harder for them to come to the United States. Are there other countries they consider going to, such as Brazil or Panama or Chile, as opposed to coming to the United States when they get in this desperate situation?
Thanks for that question. And this is something that, as you all know, has been in the news over the past year, especially with the number of both migrants and unaccompanied minors from Central America that have been coming to the United States, and especially in this region, in the greater DC region, where one of the largest populations of Central Americans in the United States live. And there's many more actually in California, but just an interesting tidbit is that Central Americans make up the plurality. Got tongue twisted there.
Right.
Plurality. Thank you. Of immigrants in the greater DC area. It's the only place in the country where they do. Salvadorans are the largest immigrant group in the DC area. And there are obviously many Guatemalans and people from other parts of Central America. There's been some excellent work done. Scholars like Maria Cristina Garcia, who's a professor of history and American studies at Cornell University, has a book called Seeking Refuge, in which she examines the history of Central American migration to not only the United States, but also Mexico and Canada. And looking at it in a regional perspective, we are able to see that certainly many Central American migrants go to other parts of Central America or to Mexico and sometimes decide to stay. Sometimes they go to Mexico with the end goal of going to Mexico. Sometimes they are en route to the United States and then decide to stay in Mexico. And depending on Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and each of their respective immigration policies might end up in a different place, depending on the particular moment that we're living in. And the benefit of seeing it in the regional perspective is we can see how different national immigration policies shape people's decisions as to where they go. So yes, people from Central America, do migrate to different parts of Central America as well as to Mexico, the United States, and Canada, but the vast majority go to either Mexico or the United States.
Let's see. We lost the mic. Where's the mic? Okay, let's go to the front next. There and then to the end. Right here.
This question, I'm afraid you're going to think is how long is a piece of string, but you've been talking for an hour about only identified undocumented workers. Do you have any educated guess about the unidentified people who are in this country from, say, Mexico?
The short answer, no. But there have been a lot of demographers who have been working on this question for a long time, and it's certainly of great interest for scholars and the public for obvious reasons. There are an estimated 11.5 million unauthorized immigrants living in the United States, although that is an estimate. Around half of those people are Mexican, or estimated to be Mexican. And that has changed over time as well, I believe. But I don't have any idea or any way of figuring out how a more accurate conclusion or estimate might be drawn. But that seems to be kind of the consensus amongst demographers and some of the migration policy folks who are in Washington. Around 11 million unauthorized immigrants, give or take, live in the United States today.
Front row in the end, and then we can go back. Fascinating. Having grown up in Western New York, I remember Mexicans working the tomato and other crops in the summertime. And you mentioned the Brazos program. How wide was that program? I mean, I know you mentioned mostly California, Texas, Mexico. I'm sorry, New Mexico, and Arizona. But they also went, as far north as Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and how far east and north did they come?
Thank you. The Bracero program from 1942 to 1964 brought hundreds of thousands of people each year, and a total, and more estimates, but a total estimate of 4.5 or 4.6 million Mexicans to the United States on short-term contracts that varied in length throughout the program's duration. The vast majority were to the Southwest as well as the West Coast, but including the northern parts of the West Coast, as you mentioned. And many people also went to work on the railroads up north and even into industry and places in the Midwest and further east. And one of the largest populations, or one of the largest states that received, or one of the states that received the largest number of Bracero workers was Arkansas and other parts of the South. And there's some excellent work forthcoming about Bracero workers and Mexican migrants in the South, which are fast growing today, certainly because of a lot of the industry and meat packing that has moved to the South in places like North Carolina and elsewhere, but has a longer history. So it was a national program and brought people to many parts of the United States, although the vast majority concentrated in the Southwest and the West Coast.
Let's go down the row.
Yes. Could you say something about the security risk in the United States of not being able to control our borders, who's coming and who's leaving, particularly with respect to, Al-Qaeda type groups, which may be going to come in and recreate havoc in this country?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this has been a concern for a long time. As I mentioned, this is something that the immigration bureaucracy and the immigration and enforcement bureaucracy has put on the table since the middle of the 20th century, if not before, but in my own research, I've certainly found it dating back to then. And I'd say today, there is that risk and possibility, although I'd say it's lower than ever before, partially because the border has never been so militarized as it is today. The number of border enforcement agents has grown exponentially. In the last 15, 20 years. There are more than 20,000 Border Patrol agents in the United States. I think more than 18,000 of those on the U.S.-Mexico border. And there are more than 700 or around 700 miles of walls or dividers separating the U.S.-Mexico border. And in many of the places where migrants have tended to cross, there is vigilance by the 18,000 plus Border Patrol agents. So kind of riffing off some of the previous topics that we discussed, I think that is a possibility, but I think it's very low, and I don't think that it is proportionate to the amount that it is discussed in the media.
Let's see, let's just go on down to the corner there.
Thank you. My name is James West, and I am in Professor Ballow's class as well, but it should be noted that I'm a JD candidate at the law school, not in the history department. True to type, I have a slightly legalistic question. In your chapter, which really is a lot about cooperation or maybe non-cooperation with the Mexican government, one thing that you noted, and I think you said it earlier, is that there's a constitutional bar for them to control the travel of their citizens within their border, which strikes me as pretty compelling. Is that in fact a structural barrier to ever having proper cooperation, or is it more used as an excuse to do what they would not want to do anyway?
Thank you, James, for your question. Maybe you could offer some more insights from the legal perspective after the session today. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, we're going to have to talk FOIA requests.
All right. Found my man. So I think a bit of both, to respond. I think that, yes, the Mexican government, was on firm ground when it stated that it couldn't bar its citizens from traveling internally within the country. That being said, they would, on occasion, certainly implement measures or policies that did or attempted to do so if they saw it in their best interests. So there's a tremendous amount of agricultural labor demand in the northern part of Mexico. And there's some instances where the Mexican government, which had agreed to transport people from the border down into the interior, which would make it harder for them to return to the United States, instead of taking them to the interior, would bring them, back north and east, where millions and millions and millions of dollars of cotton needed to be harvested or needed to be tended. And they did it for their own reasons as well, with their own best interests in mind. I think that something that some scholars have put forth in recent years is kind of revisionary histories of immigration policy, and this particular moment in the 1950s with Operation Wetback was the collaborative nature of the campaign and the U.S. and Mexican governments collaborating to effect these deportations. And I think there's certainly truth to that. And I also think we need to interrogate a bit more closely the extent of the collaboration and distinguish, if we can, the difference between the rhetoric of the Mexican government during this time and their actions. The talk and the walk, I don't think always lined up. And there's some accounts where the U.S. Border Patrol sent agents undercover, posing as migrants who were apprehended and then put in a detention center and then deported, to get a sense of what the deportees were thinking and what their plans were, et cetera. And one of these accounts, which is told in great detail, where the U.S. immigration agent was deported from Nogales, Arizona, crossed the border to Nogales, Sonora in Mexico, and then taken on a train along with 59 other deportees. The Mexican government had an agent there, an official, who was supposed to guard them until they arrived into the Mexican interior. And what the agent told in his report was that the Mexican official on board could have cared less if people actually stayed on the train. Most people got off at transportation centers to easily return to the border. And by the time the train reached its final destination in the interior of Mexico, I think one or two of the 60 original people were aboard. So the Mexican government nominally was helping, and in some cases certainly did, but in other cases, may have, on a level of high politics and diplomacy, been on board. But when it came down to it, they were strapped for cash and they had other interests.
Didn't you note that those couple remaining people were at risk of long prison
That's
sentences if they
right.
came back as well?
Yeah,
on
they
the
had been
US side?
deported previously, so they decided to stay on.
Right. Okay. Lee, run the on the side here, Kathleen. Yes.
I'm Lee Middleditch, a local lawyer, and I take it that the statistics regarding the Braceros program have been pretty well developed in terms of the numbers who came and the numbers who went back. I'm curious as to whether there was any effort to determine the progeny of many of those basically men in the United States who were fathers of citizens who would be born on this soil.
And that's a topic that has been worked on and that many scholars have looked at. Thank you, Lee, for your question. And many historians, as well as social scientists, sociologists particularly, have looked at not only the immigrant generation, as sometimes referred, but also the second generation or generation 1.5, people that came as children who arrived in the United States and then grew up here. Statistically, I'm not sure of the numbers of that, but certainly a lot of people that came on these temporary contracts stayed or continued to come. They, like the growers and the people that depended on their labor, became accustomed to these routines and the work cycle and the opportunity to earn money and provide for their families, or they met people while here. Kind of best laid plans that find their own paths. I think certainly it was the case here. And another important distinction is that people came either as braceros or unauthorized workers, but oftentimes an individual would come to the United States to work, sometimes as a bracero, sometimes as an unauthorized worker, or would come to the United States as a bracero and then overstay their work contract and continue to work. So there's kind of a false division. I guess we shouldn't be thinking about the quote-unquote good and bad, because many times it was the same people. They wanted to come and earn money for their families and provide the labor that the U.S. needed and demanded at that point in time, and how they came was secondary. And an interesting kind of an interesting point that came through in my oral history work is that most people who migrated during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they refer to themselves, or they were referred to as braceros, regardless of how they went, regardless of with or without a contract. They were braceros. So people in Mexico, don't necessarily make this administrative or legal distinction. And most of the people I talked to as well, sometimes they went as a bracero, sometimes they went without a contract. But I think that certainly many of the people who ended up staying in the United States, and the fact that today, Mexicans and people of Mexican origin and ethnic Mexicans make up about 33 or 34 million people in the United States today, 11 or 12% maybe of the entire U.S. population. Around a third of those immigrants, around 11 million Mexican immigrants, and half of that number, as I mentioned earlier, unauthorized immigrants. And a lot of the people that are here today, first started coming or really solidified their patterns of migration during the bracero era and have carried on since.
I was just curious, you mentioned doing oral histories. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that process, how you go about doing oral histories with migrant workers, even identifying them, making the connections, the process there.
Sure. Yeah, as I mentioned, I was hoping when I first started my research, and I hope to continue to conduct more oral histories, both with people here in the United States, as well as people in Mexico. And I've also conducted one oral history and would like to do more with former Border Patrol agents and immigration officials. The process of identifying them has been somewhat piecemeal. Some I've found through different immigrant service organizations in Chicago, specifically. And these are people that are living here in the United States today that have had a history of migration and deportation as well. And people in Mexico that identified, it's not much of an exaggeration to say that you could go to some of the historic sending states like Jalisco, Michoacan, Zacatecas, and other places, and go to any small town, and chances are there's been a lot of people who have migrated, who have family members that have migrated, and have had their own experiences. So one of my primary contacts in Mexico is a professor, Jorge Durand, who's an anthropologist who's collaborated and done some really excellent work with something called the Mexican Migration Project, which is based at the University of Guadalajara in central Mexico, as well as Princeton in New Jersey. And his collaborator is a sociologist named Douglas Massey, who's one of the foremost experts in Mexican migration. And Professor Durand had put me in touch with some of the people that he knows, because for their Mexican Migration Project, they go out and do surveys of these small communities. And one thing led to another, and I ended up in a small town where those people that you saw in the earlier image were from. And I talked to many, many people in that town, and most of the men above the age of 40, I would say, had had some kind of experience. And I stayed for a while as well, trying to get to have a better sense of the town and the feel for the town as well as the people. I stayed with a family there who was very generous in opening their doors and their home to me. And I wanted to not only understand their experiences, of being deported or migrating, but their life stories as well. So first, I think getting a sense of their own life histories and stories, which a lot of times, maybe no one had ever asked them in such terms to tell, but I think is really essential to include in the histories that we write, and creating more archival sources available for the public and for future scholars. So all of my oral histories I've recorded on kind of high quality digital recorders, digital audio recorders, and will be donated to the archive at the University of Pennsylvania when I'm done, so that scholars in the future and other people in the future will be able to use those sources. And so those stories will be able to be included in the histories that are written and remembered.
Wonderful. It's great work. Okay, we are close to the end of our time. How many more questions would we in theory have out there? Show of hands real quick. Okay, why don't we take both questions in succession, and you can just do it as sort of a rapid fire round.
Great.
Thank you. There's been a lot, obviously, in the press about the growing numbers of Hispanics in the United States. I'm just wondering, in a lot of the reading, people you hear get frustrated when they make a phone call and says press 1 if you want to continue in English. I know at the university we now have La Clinica for Hispanic patients. I wondered if you could just speak to what your thoughts might be on either, I don't know if you want to call it racial profiling or prejudice towards these individuals.
Thank you.
Hello. Thanks for a great discussion today. This has been wonderful. I'm a bit of a rogue. I'm a filmmaker, so I've come here because my work is based on looking at migration and specifically criminalization and detention between the EU and the US, so sort of parallels in policy. But my specific question for you is around the statistics on recent deportations. I know that Obama has deported more people than anyone, any administration. And also there's specific tactics, like you mentioned, the Sonoran Desert, the migrant deaths. There's some recent human rights reports that have come out about articles being stolen and, belongings that are taken along the journey. the felony conviction that can be carried along with these things. You spoke on these issues as well. And then also, we haven't really touched on this, but all of the sort of issues around drug trade and trafficking and stemming the flow of these issues and how it's all sort of tied up in the rhetoric. But I'm wondering, with all these different tactics, have we seen a decrease in deportations? Have we seen any statistical data that backs up all of the money that we're putting on the border and into these policies? Thank you.
Great. So to handle both, and I don't know if it's possible to put the last slide I had up, but if that is possible, that would be great. If not, that is fine. Great. We'll get to that in 1 minute. The first question about racial profiling and the changing demographics of the United States. Yeah, I think that this is certainly something that has a longer history and isn't necessarily new. By any means, the United States has long been diverse and multilingual, and people have continued to both speak the language that they came to the country with and also learn English. And statistics, support that many immigrants learn English, certainly, and their children, of course, do. And these kind of fears, I think, of people not assimilating or people not being, really part of the country, quote unquote, are a bit misguided. I think that the national identity is certainly changing and in flux, just as it always has been. But I don't think that it's necessarily that new. The question of racial profiling, I think, certainly has played out in very important ways in recent years with a lot of state-level immigration policies and laws, and policies like 287G, federal policy on a local level and secure communities, which until recently was one of the main ways in which the federal government was identifying people by collaborating with local law enforcement officials to apprehend people in the country without authorization that might have committed minor offenses, or there was suspicion to believe that they were. And I think that's certainly a problem. I'm not optimistic that it'll necessarily change, and there's kind of pending cases in the past in Arizona as well about the Supreme Court's decision about the extent to which race can be used as a factor in whether or not to pull someone over, whether or not to stop or apprehend someone. And I think that this is going to be something that's ongoing in the future, and I guess we will see how it plays out. I'm not in the business of making predictions. That's the benefit of being an historian. I guess you can take a easy out in a sense, but history's surprised us enough times to be cautious in that front. The other question about recent statistics on immigration and deportation under President Obama, as well as drug trade and trafficking and the various points that you brought up. I don't know if I'll be able to get to all of them, but getting to very specifically the question you had about the numbers. One of the things that I'm trying to put forth in my project is that deportations actually aren't at an all-time high under President Obama. So you see that at the end there, right? In 2012, deportations, the red line, are actually considerably lower than they were in 2000. If you're defining deportation as the sum of these removals and returns, there's no way to get at that third category of the scare tactic-driven publicity campaigns that are used to encourage people to leave the country as well. So deportations aren't at an all-time high, but removals are, right? That blue line, which really was flat up until 1996, is now greater than the green line representing these voluntary departures. And this is where I think it's important for us to focus on not only the stats and the numbers and saying that President Obama has deported more people than ever before. I don't think that's true if we have an expansive definition of deportation. And deportation, as I understand it, is when someone is forced to leave the country by order of the federal government. And I think that if that's how we're understanding it, we have to have this more expansive definition. And we see then that they've actually dropped. Deportations have dropped, but removals have increased. And the important point is that as removals have increased and as more money has been put on immigration enforcement in recent years, deportation has become more punitive than ever before, and the consequences of being deported are harsher than they ever have been. And I think that's what we should be focusing on, as opposed to just a number without any context behind it.
Okay, well, thank you all. These have been wonderful and engaging questions, and a big thank you to Adam for his presentation today.